I pretended to know nothing while my husband was quietly preparing divorce papers to get back with his ex-girlfriend. He thought he was being careful. He thought I was distracted, emotional, unaware. While he planned his exit, I was studying every account, every signature, every legal blind spot. I smiled. I cooked dinner. I played the perfect wife. And while he imagined his new life starting, I was methodically dismantling the one he was standing on. I found out the way women often do when they're being underestimated. Not through confession, not through confrontation, through carelessness born of certainty. He thought I wasn't paying attention anymore, and in a way, he was right. I wasn't paying attention to him. I was paying attention to everything else. The first sign was subtle. A shift in tone when he talked about the future. Fewer we statements. More I. He started spending longer hours on his phone, angling the screen away from me on the couch, lowering his voice when he took calls in the other room. He began talking about finances in vague, dismissive terms, brushing off questions he used to answer easily. "I'll handle it," he'd say, with a smile that assumed obedience. Then there was her. Not a name at first, just an absence. He stopped mentioning the past altogether, as if erasing it would make room for something old to return. I noticed the way he dressed differently on certain days, the way he lingered before leaving the house, the way his mood lifted after particular phone calls. I noticed because I always had. He simply forgot that noticing didn't mean reacting. One evening, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the nightstand. A notification preview, carelessly left visible. A name I hadn't heard in years. His ex-girlfriend. Short message. Familiar tone. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Context has a sound to it, and that sound was unmistakable. From that moment on, I pretended to know nothing. I laughed at his jokes. I cooked his favorite meals. I asked about his day with genuine interest. I played the role so convincingly that he relaxed completely, mistaking composure for ignorance. He didn't realize that my calm wasn't confusion. It was calculation. While he was preparing divorce papers in secret, meeting with lawyers under the guise of work lunches, I was doing my own homework, quietly, methodically. I pulled copies of documents I'd signed years ago without question. I reviewed account histories. I revisited clauses I'd once skimmed, trusting his explanations. I didn't act rashly. I consulted professionals. I asked careful questions framed as hypotheticals. I learned exactly where I stood and what I was entitled to protect. What surprised me most was not his betrayal, but his assumption. He assumed I'd be blindsided, emotional, reactive, that I would discover the divorce papers too late, when everything had already been decided. He assumed I would fight from a position of shock. He built his plan around that assumption. I built mine around the law. Every move I made was clean, documented, advisable. I separated assets that were legally mine to manage. I restructured holdings that had always been under my authority but had been treated as shared by default. I sold what I was allowed to sell. I transferred what I was permitted to transfer. Not in a rush, not dramatically, slowly enough that it looked like routine financial housekeeping, which it was. At dinner, he talked about fresh starts, about how people grow apart, about honesty. I nodded sympathetically, even agreed once, saying change was inevitable if people stopped communicating. The irony didn't escape me. It sharpened my focus. At night, he slept easily beside me, confident in his timeline. He didn't notice the spreadsheets open on my laptop earlier in the evening. He didn't question the emails I sent during the day. He didn't wonder why I suddenly asked thoughtful questions about contingencies and protections. He thought I was nesting, preparing, clinging. I was preparing, yes, just not for the future he imagined. The day he told me he needed to talk, his tone solemn and rehearsed, I was ready. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes careful. He spoke about drifting apart, about reconnecting with someone from his past, about wanting a clean, respectful separation. He slid the folder across the table like a peace offering. Divorce papers. I looked at them, then at him. Then I smiled softly and said, "I understand." Relief flooded his face. Immediate, unchecked. He hadn't prepared for acceptance. He'd prepared for tears. What he didn't know was that by the time those papers touched the table, There was almost nothing left for him to take. The accounts he'd assumed would carry him into his next life were no longer accessible. The assets he believed were shared had been legally repositioned. The safety net he'd counted on had already been folded away. I signed calmly, even thanked him for being honest. He kissed my forehead that night, already halfway gone. And as I watched him walk away, I felt no urge to stop him. He was leaving with exactly what he had planned for. He just didn't realize how little that was. After he handed me the papers, something in him visibly relaxed. It was subtle, but I caught it. The easing of his shoulders, the way his breath finally settled. He thought the hardest part was over. He thought my calm acceptance meant I hadn't understood the full weight of what was happening. In his mind, silence had always meant surrender. He couldn't have been more wrong. In the days that followed, he became almost kind, attentive in a way he hadn't been for years. He asked if I needed anything, offered to make coffee in the mornings, spoke gently, as if afraid a wrong tone might suddenly wake me from the role I was playing. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so revealing. Guilt had softened him, but not enough to make him honest. He moved out quickly, citing the need for space to keep things amicable. I agreed without hesitation. I even helped him pack, folded shirts, labeled boxes, handed him items I knew he'd want in his new life. I watched him carry pieces of our marriage out the door, completely unaware that the most important pieces had already been removed. Once he was gone, the house grew quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than empty. I sat at the same kitchen table where he'd slid the divorce papers toward me and opened my laptop. This was the phase that required precision. No emotion, no impulsive decisions. Just follow through. I finalized transactions that had been in motion for weeks. Assets that were legally mine were now fully separated, no longer entangled by convenience or assumption. I closed joint discretionary accounts in accordance with the agreements already in place. I ensured every step aligned with existing contracts and legal advice. Nothing hidden, nothing rushed, just orderly, irreversible change. Meanwhile, he began constructing his new life with confidence. I knew because he couldn't help himself. He called to tell me he'd found an apartment, mentioned casually that he'd reconnected deeply with his ex, that things felt right again. He spoke as if expecting validation, or at least acknowledgement of his happiness. I listened politely and wished him well. Each conversation left him more assured, more careless. What he didn't realize was that his certainty was built on outdated information. The first sign of trouble came sooner than I expected. He called one afternoon, his voice tense but controlled. He asked a question about an account he believed was still active. I answered truthfully, explaining it had been restructured weeks earlier under my authority. There was a pause on the line, long enough for confusion to register. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "It does," I replied calmly. "It was always under my management." He changed the subject quickly, but the seed had been planted. Over the next few days, his calls increased. The questions became more specific, more urgent. He was starting to realize that the financial picture he'd been counting on no longer existed in the way he'd imagined. Still, he didn't panic. Not yet. He assumed it was a temporary inconvenience, a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with the right phone call. He was used to problems yielding when pressed. He was used to me smoothing things over. I didn't. By the time his lawyer contacted mine with concerns about unexpected changes, the reality was unavoidable. The assets he had planned to leverage in the divorce were either no longer shared or no longer available. Not because I'd done anything improper, but because I'd finally exercised the autonomy I'd always had. That was when his tone changed. The next call wasn't casual. It wasn't friendly. It was sharp with disbelief. "How could you do this without telling me?" he demanded. "I didn't hide anything," I said. "I just didn't announce it." Silence followed. Heavy, unsettling. For the first time, he was experiencing what I had felt for months, the ground shifting beneath him while the other person remained calm. "You knew," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. "I knew." The line went dead, and in that silence, I understood something clearly. He hadn't been planning a fair ending. He'd been planning an exit that left him comfortable and me scrambling. My mistake, in his mind, was not emotional retaliation, but strategic awareness. He thought he was leaving me behind. Instead, he was walking into a future with no safety net, no leverage, and no one left to blame but himself that he didn't call again that night. Or the next morning. Silence, when it came from him, was never restraint. It was regrouping. I knew him well enough to recognize the pattern. He would be replaying conversations, recalculating timelines, trying to locate the point where control slipped out of his hands. What he wouldn't find was a single dramatic moment. This hadn't been a confrontation. It had been erosion. The next communication came through his lawyer. The tone was careful, almost confused. There were questions about asset distribution, about timing, about authority. Phrases like, "We were under the impression," and "it appears there may have been a misunderstanding," appeared more than once. My attorney responded with documentation. Clear, neutral, unemotional. Every action tied to an existing agreement. Every transfer supported by paper trails that predated the divorce filing itself. That was when the panic set in. He showed up at the house unannounced 3 days later. I watched him through the window as he stood on the porch, jaw tight, phone in hand, rehearsing what he would say. He knocked once, then again louder. I waited before opening the door, not out of fear, but intention. Timing matters when power dynamics shift. When I finally opened it, he looked at me like I was a stranger. "We need to talk," he said, the words sharp with urgency. I replied calmly, stepping aside so he could see I wasn't blocking him out of spite. I just wasn't inviting him in. He launched into it immediately. The accounts, the properties, the liquidity he'd assumed would be there. He spoke quickly, anger barely contained beneath disbelief. "You knew I was planning to start over," he said. I knew you were planning a divorce." I interrupted. "I didn't know you were planning to rely on my silence to fund your next life." That stopped him. He stared at me, recalibrating. "That's not what this was," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was just trying to be fair." I nodded once. "Then you should be relieved. Everything I did was." He took a step closer, lowering his voice as if volume might restore intimacy. "You could have warned me." I agreed. "You could have warned me too." The comparison landed harder than anything I could have accused him of. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't have a counterargument. He'd spent months believing he was the only one planning ahead. The realization that I had been doing the same, quietly, competently, unsettled him more than anger ever could. "You're trying to ruin me," he said finally. I shook my head. "I'm trying to protect myself. The fact that it feels like ruin to you is not my responsibility." He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "You always did this," he said, acted calm while everything burned. I met his gaze steadily. "No," I said. "I acted calm while I built fire breaks." He left shortly after that, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I closed it gently behind him, the contrast deliberate. Outside, his car roared to life, tires screeching as he pulled away. Inside, the house was still. In the days that followed, the consequences accelerated. His lawyer pushed harder, then stopped. The tone shifted from challenge to damage control. Proposals became requests. Requests became appeals. It was clear now that his financial position was far weaker than he'd planned for. The ex-girlfriend he'd been so eager to return to was no longer an abstract future. She was a present complication, one that came with expectations he could no longer meet. He called once more, late at night. This time, there was no anger, just strain. "I don't know how I'm supposed to do this," he said quietly. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You should have thought about that before assuming I would absorb the impact," I replied. "I'm not your contingency plan anymore." There was a long pause on the line. Then, softly, "You were never supposed to find out this way." I closed my eyes briefly. I found out the way people do when they're finally paying attention. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet and let the reality settle. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was the natural outcome of a plan built on someone else's ignorance. He had mistaken my composure for passivity, my loyalty for liability. And now, the future he'd been so eager to claim was unraveling, thread by thread. Not because I had attacked him, but because I had stopped protecting him. The first call from her came a week later. I didn't answer at first. I watched the name light up my screen and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not jealousy, but curiosity. This was the woman he had been planning his future around. The reason he believed the divorce would be clean, swift, and ultimately profitable. I let the phone ring out, then placed it face down on the table and finished my coffee. She called again that afternoon. This time I answered. Her voice was tight, controlled, trying very hard to sound reasonable. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, she said. He told me certain things were already settled. I leaned back in my chair and listened, not to the words themselves, but to the strain beneath them. She wasn't calling out of concern for me. She was calling because her own expectations were starting to wobble. What things? I asked calmly. There was a pause. The house, she said. The accounts. The security. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Those things were never his to promise. Silence stretched between us. I imagined her recalculating the way people do when they realize they've built a future on borrowed assumptions. He said you agreed. She tried again. That you were being cooperative. I replied. With the law. The call ended shortly after that. Not angrily. Uneasily. She had learned something important in those few minutes, even if she wasn't ready to name it yet. Whatever he had sold her, stability, comfort, continuity, it was already gone. That evening, my phone lit up again. This time it was him. You talked to her, he said without preamble. Yes, I replied. You didn't have to do that, he snapped. I didn't seek her out, I said. She called me. You're poisoning things, he accused. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I almost laughed. I'm not making anything harder, I said evenly. I'm just not cushioning the truth. He exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding through. You knew I was counting on those assets, he said. You knew what I was planning. I knew you were planning a divorce, I repeated. I didn't know you were planning to finance a new relationship with resources you assumed I'd leave untouched. That's not fair, he said. No, I corrected him. It's accurate. After that, things unraveled quickly. His ex began asking questions he couldn't answer. Questions about timelines, about access, about why certain plans kept being delayed. The certainty he'd projected started to crack under scrutiny. She wanted reassurance. He had none to give. At the same time, his professional life began to feel the strain. Without the financial buffer he'd expected, decisions became riskier. Commitments he'd already made suddenly felt heavy. The confidence that had once made him attractive to clients, to partners, to her, started to erode. I heard about it indirectly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned he seemed distracted. Another noted that he'd pulled out of a planned investment at the last minute. Each comment was small, almost insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. Meanwhile, my own life settled into a new rhythm. I no longer woke with the low-grade tension that had accompanied the last year of our marriage. I slept through the night. I made plans without contingency clauses. I trusted my own stability because it wasn't dependent on someone else's narrative. One afternoon, as I was reviewing documents with my attorney, she looked up and said, "You handled this well." I nodded. I handled it legally. She smiled slightly. Most people don't. What she didn't say, but what we both understood, was that most people react too late. They discover the betrayal after the leverage is gone. They scramble while the other person moves confidently forward. I hadn't done that. I had paid attention. I had waited. And when the time came, I acted without announcing it. That night, as I locked the door and turned off the lights, I thought about the future he'd been so eager to reclaim. The life he'd planned to step into fully funded, fully supported. It hadn't collapsed because I sabotaged it. It collapsed because it was built on the assumption that I would remain unaware. And once that assumption failed, everything else followed. That'd be why the time he understood the depth of what had happened, it was no longer a question of reversing anything. It was a question of survival. The confidence he'd carried into the divorce, the quiet certainty that he would emerge untouched, even improved, had evaporated, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Consequences. He tried to mask it at first. I could hear it in his voice when he called, the forced steadiness, the deliberate pauses. He spoke about temporary setbacks and restructuring. He framed everything as a minor inconvenience that would resolve itself with time. That was his instinct when control slipped. Rename the problem until it felt manageable. But time wasn't working in his favor. The lawyers had stopped debating and started confirming. Numbers didn't bend to intention. Agreements didn't care about regret. Each email he received clarified what he had lost access to, what had already been finalized, what could not be reclaimed. The assets he'd assumed would fund his transition were gone, and the reality of starting over without them began to sink in. He came to the house again one afternoon, unannounced. I saw his car pull into the driveway and felt no spike of anxiety, no urge to hide. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked startled by that, as if he'd expected resistance, not readiness. "You look fine," he said. "I am," I replied. That seemed to irritate him more than anger would have. He stepped inside without asking, glancing around as if expecting to see evidence of distress. The house was orderly, quiet, grounded. The absence of chaos undermined the narrative he'd been telling himself. He paced for a moment before speaking. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." He stopped, turning to face me. "You planned this." I didn't deny it. "I prepared," I said, "the way you did." "That's not the same," he snapped. "It's exactly the same," I replied. "You just didn't think I was capable of it." That landed harder than anything else I'd said. He looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition. For the first time, he was seeing me not as the role I'd played, but as the person who had been managing more than he'd ever known. "You let me believe you didn't know," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "because you needed to believe that." He sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "She's leaving," he admitted. I said nothing. "She says I misled her," he continued, "that I promised things I can't deliver." I waited, letting him hear his own words. Promised things he didn't own. Planned futures he couldn't fund. Built expectations on my silence. "You should have been honest," he said, as if the accusation might still land. I replied. "Just not with you." He laughed bitterly. "You destroyed everything." I shook my head slowly. "You destroyed it the moment you decided to plan a future that required my ignorance." The conversation ended shortly after that. Not with resolution, but with exhaustion. He left without slamming the door this time. Without theatrics. He walked out like someone who had finally realized there was nothing left to negotiate. In the weeks that followed, the full impact became visible. His lifestyle contracted quickly. Plans are canceled. Commitments revised. The ex-girlfriend disappeared entirely, taking with her the illusion that this divorce had been a gateway rather than a reckoning. Without the financial cushion he'd expected, his margin for error vanished. I heard about it indirectly, the way news always travels. He was downsizing. He was stressed. He was angry. He was blaming everyone but himself. None of it reached me emotionally. The distance was complete now. My own life, by contrast, felt unexpectedly stable. Not extravagant. Not dramatic, just solid. I had safeguarded what was mine, and in doing so, I'd safeguarded something else as well. My sense of agency. One evening, as I sat reviewing final documents, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. There was a difference. Victory implies an opponent. This had never been a competition. It had been a correction. He had assumed my silence meant ignorance. He had assumed my composure meant weakness. He had assumed my loyalty would extend even to my own disadvantage. Those assumptions had shaped his entire plan, and when they proved false, there was nothing left to hold it together. What unraveled him wasn't the loss of money. Not really. It was the loss of certainty. He had built his confidence on the idea that he was always a step ahead, always the one managing outcomes while other people reacted. When that belief collapsed, it took everything else with it. I saw it in the way he stopped speaking in absolutes. Where he once said when, he now said if. Where he once planned months ahead, he now hesitated over the next week. Control had been his identity. Without it, he was unrecognizable, even to himself. His lawyer requested another meeting. This time, the tone was different. No demands, no accusations, just cautious questions, as if probing for a weakness that might still exist. My attorney handled it with the same calm professionalism as before. The answer was unchanged. Everything had been executed within the boundaries of the law. Everything was documented. Everything was final. There would be no undoing this. After that meeting, his attempts at contact slowed. Not because he had accepted the situation, but because he no longer knew where to push. Every lever he'd expected to find had already been removed. Every assumption he'd built his strategy on had proven false. Silence replaced certainty. And for him, silence was unbearable. I, on the other hand, found it restorative. Days passed without his name appearing on my phone. Weeks followed with no indirect messages, no mutual friends testing the waters. The noise fell away, leaving behind something unfamiliar but welcome. Peace without vigilance. I began to notice how much energy I'd spent for years anticipating his reactions, softening my language, timing my concerns, choosing my battles. That mental load had vanished almost overnight. In its place was clarity. Decisions were simpler when they only needed to align with my own values. One afternoon, I ran into someone who knew both of us well. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "You didn't think you had it in you." I smiled faintly. That's why it worked. She nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. What he had mistaken for naivety had always been discipline. What he saw as passivity had been patience. I hadn't needed to dominate the marriage to understand its mechanics. I had simply watched, learned, and when the moment came, acted with precision. I almost thanked him for the honesty. That sentence explained everything. It explained why he'd been so careless with his phone, why he'd spoken about the divorce as if it were a favor he was granting me, why he'd assumed I would be emotionally disoriented while he moved forward confidently. He hadn't just underestimated my awareness. He had underestimated my autonomy. "You never needed to think about it," I said, "because I never made you." He exhaled slowly. "She thought you'd fight," he admitted. "She said you try to drag things out." I smiled faintly. "You told her the wrong story." That was when the full weight of his miscalculation settled in. He had framed me as an obstacle to be managed, not a partner with independent capacity. He had sold that narrative to his ex, to his lawyer, and most importantly, to himself. When reality contradicted it, everything else collapsed. "I don't know how to rebuild from this," he said quietly. "That's not my problem anymore," I replied. Not unkindly, definitively. After that call, something fundamental changed. He stopped reaching out entirely, not because he had found peace, but because he had finally understood the truth he'd avoided for years. I had never been dependent on him. I had been accommodating him. An accommodation, once withdrawn, reveals just how little was actually holding things together. The weeks that followed were quiet. No legal flare-ups, no emotional ambushes, just final confirmations and procedural closures. His life contracted into something smaller, more constrained, while mine expanded steadily. Not through excess, but through stability. I took on a long postponed project at work. I traveled alone without checking in with anyone. I made decisions quickly and trusted them. The ease with which I moved through my days surprised me. I hadn't realized how much effort it took to remain palatable to someone who benefited from my restraint. One evening, a friend asked if I felt guilty. "For what?" I asked. "For leaving him with nothing." I shook my head. I didn't leave him with nothing. I left him with exactly what he built. That distinction mattered. I hadn't taken what wasn't mine. I hadn't hidden assets or manipulated outcomes. I had simply stopped allowing my competence to be treated as communal property. Once that stopped, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. He had planned a divorce that assumed my compliance. I had planned a future that didn't require it. And once those plans collided, only one of them was sustainable. The most revealing part of everything came afterward, once the dust had settled and there was nothing left to contest. When people asked him what happened, he struggled. Not because the facts were complicated, but because the truth didn't support the version of himself he'd been living in. There was no clean narrative where he was both the architect and the victim. Something had to give. At first, he tried omission. He talked about timing issues, about unexpected complications. He framed the divorce as mutual, amicable, strategically planned. But stories built on vagueness don't travel well. They invite questions, and questions expose gaps. People began to notice that his circumstances didn't match his confidence. That the life he described, new relationship, fresh start, financial freedom, never quite materialized. The apartment he'd mentioned became smaller. The plans he'd hinted at were quietly dropped. Invitations went unanswered. His presence dimmed in rooms where he'd once commanded attention. I watched this from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This was the cost of building a future on borrowed certainty. One afternoon, a mutual acquaintance reached out, hesitant. "He says you blindsided him," she said carefully, "that you moved things around without warning." I consider my response. "I didn't blindside him," I said. "I just didn't interrupt him while he was making assumptions." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That makes sense." That was how it happened, conversation by conversation. Without confrontation, without defense. The truth didn't need my advocacy. It stood on its own. His version required constant maintenance. Mine required nothing at all. Meanwhile, my own days grew fuller in ways that felt earned rather than reactive. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped anticipating disruptions. I trusted that what was settled would remain settled. That trust changed how I carried myself. People responded to it instinctively. One evening, as I sat with friends over dinner, someone asked what I'd learned from the whole experience. I thought about it carefully before answering. I learned that silence isn't weakness, I said. It's a strategy. And when used correctly, it tells you everything you need to know about the person standing across from you. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I reflected on how close I'd come to missing it all. If I confronted him too early, if I'd demanded explanations, if I'd reacted instead of observed, the outcome would have been very different. He would have adjusted, hidden better, protected himself. Instead, I had let him believe his own story long enough to expose its flaws. He had assumed I was unaware because I was calm. He had mistaken my lack of reaction for lack of insight. That misjudgment had cost him everything he thought was guaranteed. I didn't need to ruin him. I didn't need to expose him publicly. I didn't need to fight. I simply needed to step aside and stop reinforcing the illusion he relied on. The rest took care of itself. By the time autumn arrived, the contrast between our lives had become unmistakable. Not in spectacle, not in appearances meant to impress, but in something far more telling: stability. Mine had settled into something solid and predictable. His had become reactive, defined by adjustments and compromises he hadn't anticipated needing to make. I noticed it first in the small things. The way I planned months ahead without hesitation. The ease with which I made financial decisions, knowing exactly what resources were available to me. The absence of that familiar background anxiety, the one that comes from depending on someone else's choices to protect your future. I hadn't realized how heavy that weight had been until it was gone. He, on the other hand, was still scrambling. I heard about it indirectly, the way these things always surface. A mutual contact mentioned he'd postponed a move he'd been talking about for months. Another noted that he'd taken on extra work unexpectedly, citing cash flow concerns. Someone else casually remarked that his ex had moved on surprisingly fast. Each comment landed without emotion. They were no longer pieces of my story. They were simply evidence of his. The most telling moment came during the final financial disclosure meeting. Not because of anything dramatic that was said, but because of what wasn't. He sat across the table from me, noticeably subdued, flipping through documents that confirmed what he already knew. There were no surprises left, no hidden reserves, no fallback options. This time, he didn't argue. At one point, he looked up from the paperwork and said quietly, "You're comfortable." It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, almost an accusation. "Yes," I replied. "I plan to be." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I thought you were just maintaining things." I said, "for myself." That distinction seemed to settle something in him. For the first time, there was no resentment in his expression, just understanding, arriving far later than it should have. He had believed stability was something I managed for both of us. He hadn't considered that I could redirect it entirely. After that meeting, there was no more friction, no attempts to renegotiate, no emotional appeals. He signed what needed to be signed and left without lingering. It felt less like closure and more like acknowledgement. In the weeks that followed, my life continued to expand quietly. I took on a leadership role I'd once declined because it would have disrupted our balance. I invested in projects I believed in without asking for consensus. I planned a long trip for the following year, something I'd always postponed because it didn't fit neatly into someone else's timeline. Each decision reinforced the same truth. I was no longer managing risk created by someone else's ambition. I was managing my own future. One evening, as I reviewed my accounts and confirmed projections with my advisor, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it had forced. I had learned decisively that security built on someone else's intentions is not security at all. True stability comes from awareness, autonomy, and preparation. He had assumed I was dependent because I was quiet. He had assumed my calm meant I would adapt to whatever outcome suited him best. Those assumptions had shaped every step of his plan, and when they proved false, there was nothing left to support it. I closed my laptop and looked around the room, the soft glow of lamplight settling comfortably around me. This wasn't a temporary recovery. It wasn't a rebound phase. It was a foundation, one I had built deliberately, without spectacle, without apology. He had been preparing to leave me with nothing. Instead, I had prepared to leave myself with everything that mattered. There was a quiet shift that happened once I stopped measuring my progress against his decline. At first, the contrast between our lives had been unavoidable. It was human to notice. But one morning, as I reviewed my calendar and planned the week ahead, I realized something had changed. I wasn't thinking about where he was, what he'd lost, or how he was coping. I was thinking about my own trajectory, uninterrupted. That was when he stopped being the reference point. The last formal interaction we had was brief and procedural. A final confirmation call with our respective attorneys to close out lingering administrative details. His voice was flat, professional, stripped of the performative confidence he once relied on. When the call ended, there was no follow-up message, no attempt at conversation. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply over. What surprised me most was how little space that ending occupied in my mind. I turned my attention fully toward what I had been building. I refined my investment strategy, diversifying without urgency. I made long-term plans that extended well beyond the horizon I'd once considered reasonable. For years, I'd subconsciously limited my vision to what felt acceptable within a marriage. Now, there was no such ceiling. The absence of constraint was intoxicating in its quietness. Friends noticed a shift before I did. "You're decisive," one of them said over lunch. Not rushed, just certain. I recognized the truth in that observation. Certainty doesn't announce itself. It settles. And once it does, everything else organizes around it. I stopped explaining my choices. When people asked why I'd taken on a new role, or invested in a particular project, or planned an extended trip, I answered simply because it made sense. That was enough. I no longer felt the need to justify decisions that aligned with my values. The habit of over-explaining had belonged to a version of me that needed approval. Occasionally, news of him still filtered through. Not intentionally, just incidentally. Someone mentioned he'd moved again. Someone else said he was considering a career pivot. Each update felt increasingly distant, like hearing about a former coworker you once knew well but no longer think about. There was no satisfaction in it, no resentment, just detachment. That detachment was the real victory, though I never thought of it that way. Victory implies conflict. This felt more like resolution. I hadn't outmaneuvered him to win. I had simply refused to be outmaneuvered at all. One afternoon, as I reviewed old files I was preparing to archive, I came across a folder labeled with his name. Financial summaries, joint plans, projections we'd once discussed together. I hesitated for a moment, then deleted it entirely. Not out of anger, out of relevance. It no longer belonged in my system. That night, I took a long walk through the city, the air crisp, the streets alive with movement. I blended into the flow effortlessly, unremarkable and entirely free. For the first time, I wasn't navigating around someone else's expectations or ambitions. I was moving according to my own internal compass. I understood then that the most powerful part of what I'd done wasn't the asset transfers or the legal precision. It was the internal shift that followed. I had stopped positioning myself in relation to him, stopped defining myself by contrast or consequence. I was no longer reacting. I was directing. He had once believed my silence meant I needed him. In reality, my silence had been the space where I learned I didn't. What he never accounted for was how quickly perception changes once certainty is gone. People had trusted him because he projected stability. When that projection cracked, they didn't rush to condemn him. They simply adjusted their distance. Trust doesn't usually disappear in a dramatic collapse. It thins. It quiets. It steps back without explanation. I saw it happen in subtle ways. Invitations that once came automatically now arrived late, if at all. Conversations that used to orbit his opinions drifted elsewhere. He was still present, still polite, still capable, but the authority he'd relied on no longer carried the same weight. Authority without grounding is fragile. Once questioned, it rarely recovers fully. He tried to rebuild it by over-explaining. He talked more than he used to, filled silences with context, justification, narrative. He framed the divorce as unexpected, then as mutual, then as a learning experience. Each version was slightly different, adjusted depending on the audience. That inconsistency did more damage than honesty ever could have. People sense when a story is being shaped rather than lived. I didn't correct any of it. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require maintenance. My life spoke for itself in a way his explanations couldn't keep up with. Stability has a presence that doesn't need endorsement. The most telling moment came when someone who had once deferred to him sought my input instead. Not dramatically, casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I realized then that influence follows competence, not volume. It migrates quietly toward wherever it feels safest. He noticed it too. He asked once, during a brief logistical exchange, "Did you tell people something?" "No," I replied. I didn't need to. That answer unsettled him more than any accusation would have. He had always believed control came from managing information. He hadn't understood that withholding participation can be just as powerful. As the months passed, his circumstances stabilized into something smaller, more constrained. Not ruined, not dramatic, just limited. The kind of limitation that comes from losing optionality. He was no longer choosing from abundance. He was choosing from necessity. I, on the other hand, experienced the opposite. Options expanded, not because I was chasing them, but because I had created conditions where they could appear. Financial clarity breeds opportunity. Emotional clarity does the same. One evening, as I reviewed plans for the coming year, I realized how far ahead I was thinking now. 5 years. 10. The horizon felt open in a way it never had before. Not because I had more resources, but because nothing was siphoning them away quietly anymore. That was the consequence he never calculated. He had assumed my competence existed in service of the marriage, that it would remain available even as he exited it. He hadn't imagined that once redirected, it would no longer include him at all. I closed my planner and sat back, letting that truth settle without judgment. There was no satisfaction in his loss, only certainty in my own position. I hadn't taken anything from him that wasn't already mine. I had simply stopped lending my awareness, my discipline, my foresight to someone who had planned a future without me in it. He had mistaken access for entitlement. And once that mistake was corrected, everything else fell into place. By the time winter settled in, the shape of my life had become unmistakably my own. Not reinvented, not dramatically transformed, but reclaimed. There was a difference. Reinvention implies erasure of the past. Reclamation acknowledges it, then builds forward without apology. I wasn't running from what had happened. I was moving beyond it with intention. My days followed a rhythm that felt earned. Morning planning sessions that focused on growth rather than maintenance. Meetings where my voice carried weight without effort. Evenings that belonged entirely to me. I noticed how rarely I felt the need to check in with anyone about my decisions. The habit had faded so naturally, I barely registered its absence. Occasionally, reminders of the old life surfaced. A familiar restaurant, a shared acquaintance, a financial report that referenced timelines we'd once discussed together. Each one landed without disturbance. They were markers of continuity, not triggers. Evidence that I could remember without reliving. I learned later that he had tried to explain everything one last time, to himself more than to anyone else. That he'd spoken about miscalculations, about trust, about how quickly things had changed. What he never seemed to grasp was that nothing had changed suddenly. I had simply stopped carrying the weight of decisions he'd made unilaterally. The most powerful part of this chapter wasn't the financial independence. It was the internal recalibration. I no longer felt compelled to be strategic about my own needs. I no longer framed my goals in ways that made them more palatable to someone else's comfort. That freedom didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with ease. One evening, while reviewing plans for the next year, I paused and smiled. Not because I had outmaneuvered anyone, but because I had trusted myself early enough to avoid damage. I hadn't waited for betrayal to become undeniable. I had paid attention when patterns emerged. That attention had been my greatest asset all along. I realized then that the story people found so compelling, the secrecy, the preparation, the quiet execution, was only interesting on the surface. The real story was simpler. I had stopped assuming goodwill where there was strategy. I had stopped confusing familiarity with safety. And once I did, everything else followed naturally. He had planned a divorce that relied on my distraction. I had planned a future that relied on my awareness. That difference shaped everything. There was a particular kind of peace that arrived once I stopped revisiting the past to understand it better. For a while, I had believed that clarity required constant analysis, that if I examined every conversation, every decision, every overlooked moment, I would eventually reach some deeper truth. What I discovered instead was that clarity doesn't come from repetition. It comes from acceptance. Acceptance that I had seen what I needed to see. Acceptance that I had acted when it mattered. Acceptance that not everything requires closure to be complete. The narrative others found so fascinating, the secrecy, the preparation, the collapse of his plans, had become strangely irrelevant to me. It belonged to an earlier phase, one that had served its purpose and no longer needed attention. My focus had shifted entirely to the present, to what I was building rather than what I had dismantled. I noticed the change most clearly in how I responded to questions. When people asked how I was doing, I didn't default to reassurance. I answered honestly, I'm well, not surviving, not managing. Well, the word felt accurate in a way it never had before. It wasn't performative. It wasn't defensive. It simply described my state. At work, I was trusted with greater responsibility, not because I demanded it, but because my consistency made it natural. I followed through. I anticipated needs. I made decisions without unnecessary consultation. Authority settled around me without resistance, the way it does when someone is no longer second-guessing their own footing. Friends commented on how grounded I seemed. I smiled and let the observation stand. Grounded was exactly right. I wasn't floating between versions of myself anymore. I was rooted in the one that had always been there, waiting. Every so often, a memory would surface unexpectedly. A conversation from years ago, a decision I deferred, a moment when I'd chosen harmony over honesty. These memories no longer carried regret. They carried information. They showed me how much I had grown, how much I had learned about the cost of silence when it's used to preserve someone else's comfort at your own expense. I also noticed how rarely I felt the need to justify my choices. That impulse had once been constant, almost automatic. Explain first. Anticipate objections. Make it easier for others to accept. Now, explanations were optional. If something mattered to me, that was reason enough. The most surprising part was how little anger remained. I had expected resentment to linger, to resurface in waves once everything slowed down. It didn't. Anger had done its job early on. It had sharpened my awareness and propelled me into action. Once that action was complete, the anger dissolved, leaving behind something far more sustainable: self-trust. I trusted myself to notice patterns. I trusted myself to act without drama. I trusted myself to protect what I built. That trust changed everything. I learned that peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from alignment, from knowing that your actions match your values, even when no one is watching. Especially then. He had lost more than money in the end. He had lost the advantage of my presence, my foresight, my quiet management of risk. He had lost access to a future he assumed would remain available regardless of his choices. That loss wasn't my doing. It was the consequence of treating my awareness as incidental rather than essential. I didn't need to witness his regret to feel complete. I didn't need acknowledgement or apology. I had already moved past the point where his understanding mattered. One evening, as I closed my notebook and turned off the light, I felt a deep sense of calm settle in. Not the temporary calm that comes from avoiding conflict, but the lasting kind that comes from resolution. The kind that doesn't require maintenance. I had pretended to know nothing while he prepared his exit. But in truth, I had known enough to secure my future before he ever realized it was at risk. The final shift happened so quietly that I almost missed it. There was no defining moment, no dramatic realization, no emotional crescendo. It arrived disguised as an ordinary day. I woke up, made coffee, reviewed my schedule, and moved through the morning without a single thought of him crossing my mind. Not avoidance, not effort, absence. That was when I knew it was complete. He no longer occupied space in my decisions, my planning, or my sense of self. Not as an antagonist, not as a lesson, not even as a reference point. He had become a closed chapter, no longer relevant to the story that was unfolding. I began to recognize how different my internal dialogue had become. I didn't ask myself how something would look to someone else. I didn't rehearse conversations that might never happen. I didn't adjust my ambitions to fit a shared narrative that no longer existed. The mental bandwidth that freed up was immense, and I redirected it entirely toward growth. Growth, I learned, doesn't announce itself loudly. It compounds. It shows up in how calmly you handle uncertainty, how quickly you adapt, how confidently you move forward without needing external validation. I felt it in my posture, my speech, the way people responded to me without hesitation. There was nothing to prove anymore. Occasionally, people still asked about him, not out of concern, but curiosity. The story had circulated, stripped down to its essentials. The quiet wife, the planned divorce, the assets that vanished before the papers were dry. I listened politely when it came up, then redirected the conversation. The details no longer mattered. What mattered was the outcome. I had protected myself before damage could be done. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found a document from years earlier, an early financial plan we drafted together. His handwriting was confident, assertive, certain of outcomes that never came to pass. I studied it for a moment, then closed the file and archived it permanently. Not out of bitterness, out of finality. That version of the future was obsolete. What replaced it was something far more stable. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. My life now reflected my values without compromise. My security rested on my own awareness, my own preparation, my own willingness to act when patterns revealed themselves. I thought back to the moment I'd first realized what he was planning. The temptation to confront him, to demand explanations, to force clarity through conflict. I understood now how easily that could have gone wrong, how quickly he would have adjusted, protected himself, rewritten the rules. Silence, in that moment, had been the most disciplined choice I could make. Not passive silence, strategic silence, the kind that gathers information instead of reacting, the kind that observes patterns instead of chasing reassurance. The kind that waits until action is irreversible. That silence had given me time. And time, used correctly, had given me control. I no longer felt the need to explain that to anyone. Those who understood didn't need clarification. Those who didn't were never my audience to begin with. As the year drew to a close, I stood at my window one evening, watching the city lights come on one by one. Each light represented a life moving forward on its own terms, unseen, uninterrupted. Mine was no different now. Quiet, steady, intentionally built. He believed I was unaware while he prepared to leave. In reality, I had been preparing to stand entirely on my own. And once I did, I realized something that changed everything. I had never needed his permission to build the life I wanted. I had only needed to stop assuming I owed him access to it. That understanding didn't feel triumphant. It felt peaceful. And that's the part no one sees when they hear the story. It wasn't about outsmarting him or leaving him with nothing. It was about recognizing my own value before it was negotiated away in silence. I didn't act in anger, and I didn't wait to be rescued. I paid attention, I trusted myself, and I moved when it mattered most. He thought I was unaware because I was quiet. What he never understood was that my silence wasn't confusion, it was clarity. And once clarity arrives, the life you build afterward no longer needs anyone else's approval to stand.